Hi, welcome to another video. So, Anthropic has finally launched Mythos. Well, technically for most people, it is called Claude Fable 5. And this naming is a little confusing, but the basic idea is simple. Claude Fable 5 and Claude Mythos 5 are the same underlying model. Fable 5 is the general release version with extra safeguards, and Mythos 5 is the less restricted version that is only available to a small number of trusted partners, starting with Project Glasswing. So, if you are using Claude as a normal user or through the normal Claude API, you are getting Fable 5. If you are a vetted cybersecurity partner or a trusted biology partner later on, then you may get Mythos 5 with some of those safeguards removed. And honestly, this launch is very interesting because Anthropic previously made Mythos sound like this almost unreleasable model. They basically said the capabilities were too sensitive, especially around cybersecurity and biology. And now, about a month later, the same model is here for general users, with guardrails around the dangerous parts. So yes, it is kind of funny. Anthropic went from, we cannot release this, to, okay, we can release this, but with classifiers and fallbacks. I get the logic, but it is still a little hypocritical in the classic Anthropic way. The pricing, though, is actually decent. Both Fable 5 and Mythos 5 are priced at $10 per million input tokens and $50 per million output tokens. According to Anthropic, that is less than half the price of Mythos Preview. Fable 5 is available everywhere now, and developers can use it through the Claude API for Pro, Max, Team, and seat-based enterprise plans. Anthropic says Fable 5 is included at no extra cost until June 22nd. Then on June 23rd, they plan to remove it from those plans and require usage credits, unless capacity allows them to extend that included window. So, basically enjoy it while it is included, because this may turn into another usage credit situation very quickly. Now, the important part here is the safeguard system. Fable 5 has new classifiers for cybersecurity, biology, chemistry, and distillation attempts. When those classifiers trigger in the Claude app, desktop app, or mobile app, the request does not just go through Fable, it falls back to the latest Opus model, which at launch is Claude Opus 4.8. And the user is supposed to be notified that the query was routed through the fallback model. In the API, it is a bit different. By default, the request is blocked, and the response includes a structured reason for the refusal. Developers can then implement their own retry logic or opt into server-side fallback. This is important because when you see Fable 5 benchmark numbers, you have to ask whether you're looking at Fable with safeguards on or Mythos with safeguards off. In normal coding and reasoning tasks, they are basically the same. But in cyber and biology-heavy areas, Fable may route away from the actual model. And Anthropic is not hiding that. In the system card, they say, Fable's cyber classifiers consistently fired across tested cyber capability evaluations. So Fable's cyber performance is nearly identical to Opus 4.8, but Mythos 5 with safeguards off is a completely different story. Now, let's talk about the benchmarks, because yes, it smokes them. On SWE-bench verified, Mythos 5 scored 95.5%, and Fable 5 scored 95%. On SWE-bench Pro, Mythos scored 80.3%, and Fable scored 80%. That is ahead of Opus 4.8 at 69.2%, GPT 5.5 at 58.6%, and Gemini 3.1 Pro at 54.2% in their table. That is a really big jump. SWE-bench verified is already getting pretty saturated, but SWE-bench Pro is still harder and more useful, so getting around 80% there is genuinely strong. On Terminal Bench 2.1, Mythos 5 scored 88%, while Fable 5 scored 84.3%. The interesting detail is that 20.9% of Fable trials hit a safety refusal and fell back to Opus 4.8 for the rest of the trajectory. So even on normal terminal tasks, the safeguards can affect the result. Opus 4.8 scored 82.7%, GPT 5.5 with the Codex harness scored 83.4%, and Gemini CLI scored 70.7%. So Fable is still very strong, but Mythos is clearly the cleaner picture of the raw model. Then there is FrontierCode from Cognition. Fable 5 ranked number 1 on the Diamond subset with a 29.3% score and a 30.2% pass rate. On the main subset, it scored 46.3% with a 48.8% pass rate. And Anthropic says that even at medium effort, Fable 5 outperformed every other model at any effort level. That is probably the most impressive coding result in the whole card, because this is not just fix a tiny GitHub issue. These are agentic coding tasks from real pull requests, with held-out tests and rubrics for production quality work. CursorBench also looks very good. Fable 5 scored 72.9% at maximum effort, which is 8.6 points above GPT 5.5's highest published effort in that benchmark. And apparently, it leads at every effort level from medium upward. So if you care about coding, this is probably the main takeaway. Fable 5 is not just a little better than Opus. It looks like a meaningful jump for long-horizon software engineering. But the cyber section is where the report gets actually wild. Anthropic says Mythos 5 has the strongest overall cyber capabilities of any model they have evaluated. On Exploit Bench, which measures progress through the software exploitation pipeline, Mythos 5 got a mean score of 10.75 capability flags and a 78% capability percentage. Mythos Preview got 9.90 and 69%. Opus 4.8 got 5.56 and 40%. GPT 5.5 got 4.4 and 34%. So, this is not a tiny difference. This is the kind of result that explains why Anthropic is putting the public release behind classifiers. On OSS Fuzz, Mythos 5 produced a memory safety crash or better on 80% of targets, and reached a write primitive or better on 32.4% of targets. Opus 4.8 was at 61.5% and 18.2%. On CyberGym, Mythos 5 reproduced 83.8% of targeted vulnerabilities on a single try and produced at least one crash in 99.4% of tasks. And then the Firefox 147 evaluation is the most ridiculous one. Without safeguards, Mythos 5 produced a full working exploit in 88.4% of trials. Mythos Preview was at 70.8%, and Opus 4.8 was only at 8.8. That is the difference between a model that can often get near the target and a model that can actually convert the bug into a working exploit. So yes, the safeguards make sense. This is exactly the kind of capability that would be very useful for defenders and very bad if abused at scale. Anthropic's mitigation is basically a two-stage system. First, a probe looks at Claude's internal activations and screens all traffic. Then, suspicious traffic is escalated to a separate LLM classifier, which decides whether the conversation should be blocked or rerouted. They also ran a bug bounty with GraySwan. As of June 5th, the public bounty had around 100,000 attempts, which they estimate as around 1,000 hours of effort. That did not produce a universal jailbreak, and there were only 2 successful task-specific jailbreaks. The private Fable bounty had 2,000 submissions and no successful jailbreaks at that point, but it is not perfect. UK AISI found single-turn jailbreaks within a few hours, and with around 2 more days, they were sometimes able to extend those into multi-turn agentic workflows. They did not get reliable, long-form task rollouts at that time, but still, this is not magic. It is hard to break, not impossible. Now, outside of coding and cyber, the benchmarks are also pretty strong. On humanities' last exam, Mythos 5 scored 59%, without tools and 64.5% with tools on Riemann Bench, which is a research-level math benchmark. Mythos 5 scored 55%, compared to 43% for Mythos Preview and 34% for Opus 4.8. On the 2026 USAMO, Mythos 5 scored 99.8% at medium-high and extra-high reasoning effort. Anthropic says that across 240 attempts, the only proof that more than one judge marked below full marks was a low-effort attempt on problem 6, where the model itself declined to claim a full solution and only proved a restricted subcase. That is honestly insane. On Arcs of Math, it scored 78.52%, ahead of GPT 5.5 at 71.48% and Gemini 3.1 Pro Preview at 64.79%. On long context graph walks, it scored 91.1% on the 256,000 token BFS subset, 99.96% on the 256,000 token parent node subset, 79.4% on the 1 million token BFS subset, and 97.5% on the 1 million token parent node subset. So, the 1 million token context is not just there as a marketing number. At least in these synthetic long context tasks, it is actually using the context better than previous models. There is also a multi-agent section, which I found pretty interesting. On BrowseComp, a single Mythos agent scored 88%, but the multi-agent setup reached 93.3%. The 10-agent team was about 2.7 times faster than the single-agent 10 million token baseline. And on harder problems, the sum to latency dropped by 4.4 times. So this is one of the first times where the system card is basically saying, yeah, multi-agent is not just a gimmick. It can be more expensive in tokens, but it can also be faster and more accurate when the task is hard enough. The multimodal side is also strong. On OS World Verified, Mythos 5 scored 85%. On GDP.pdf, Fable 5 had a 29.8% strict pass rate in Surge's harness, ahead of Opus 4.8, GPT 5.5, and Gemini 3.1 Pro. In Anthropic's internal tool-based version, Mythos 5 got an 87.6% mean criteria pass rate. On Blueprint Bench 2, Fable 5 scored 38.6%, which is state-of-the-art among the models they list, but still below the human baseline of 58.6%. And I like that detail because it shows there is still a lot of headroom. These models are getting better at vision and spatial reasoning, but they are not magically human level at everything. On BenchCAD Vision 2 code, Mythos 5 got 0.384 voxel IOU without tools, and on a 1000 file subset, it jumped from 0.379 without tools to 0.650 with Python tools. That is a great example of where the model itself is good, but the tool loop is what makes it much more useful. For professional work, the results are also pretty good. In Real-World Finance V2, Fable or Mythos 5 was preferred over Opus 4.8 in 74% of pairwise comparisons and over Mythos Preview in 64%. On GDP-Val AA from Artificial Analysis, Fable 5 got the top score on the leaderboard and led Opus 4.8 by around 42 elo points while using fewer turns and tokens. On the Legal Agent benchmark, Mythos 5 got a 16.91% all-pass rate and a 92% mean criterion pass rate. That all-pass number may sound low, but legal agent benchmarks are brutal because you only pass if every requirement is satisfied. Harvey's held-out set also ranked Fable 5 highest at 13.3% all-pass. For tool use, Mythos and Fable got 61.7% pass at 1 on Toolathlon, and Fable got 83.3% on MCP Atlas, slightly above Opus 4.8. So the picture is very consistent. Fable is not just better at chat, it is better at doing long, messy, agentic work. Now, the life sciences section is one of the reasons Fable has restrictions. Anthropic treats Mythos 5 as having CB1 capabilities, which basically means it can significantly help with non-novel chemical or biological weapons production. They say it does not cross the CB2 threshold for novel weapon synthesis, but this judgment is much less clear than for previous models. That is a very Anthropic sentence, but it matters. They are basically saying, no, this is not replacing a world-class bioweapons expert end-to-end, but it can likely accelerate well-resourced expert teams and materially increase their chances of success. At the same time, it is clearly useful for legitimate biology. On Biomystery Bench, Mythos 5 scored 83.9% on the human solvable subset and 46.1% on the human difficult subset. On structural biology, it scored 87.2% compared to 79% for Opus 4.8. On organic chemistry, it scored 90.1% compared to 86.2% for Opus 4.8 and 56.2% for Sonnet 4.6. So, again, this is the dual-use problem. The same model that can help with drug discovery and research can also help with things you really do not want random people optimizing. The agentic safety section is also worth talking about. On malicious Claude code prompts, Mythos 5 refused 90.25% of malicious cyber-related requests. That is slightly worse than Opus 4.8 and Mythos Preview, which were both around 95%, but it had the strongest success rate on dual-use and benign prompts at 99.64%. So it is more helpful, but also slightly more willing to comply when it should not, without the extra safeguards. On prompt injection, the results are mostly positive. On the external agent red teaming benchmark from GraySwan, Mythos 5 had a K equals 100 attack success rate of 4.8%, improving over Mythos Preview at 6.1%, and Opus 4.8 at 9.6%. For coding prompt injection with adaptive attackers, it was much better than Opus 4.8, though not as perfect as Mythos Preview. For browser use environments, the first safeguards still left Mythos behind Opus 4.8 and Mythos Preview, but the updated safeguards reduced successful attacks to 0 out of 129 scenarios. So I would say the security story is good, but not trust agents with everything and go to sleep good. Prompt injection is still one of the biggest unsolved problems for agentic systems. Now, the alignment section is where the system card becomes very interesting and very weird. Anthropic says Mythos 5 is broadly comparable to Opus 4.8 on safety and alignment, slightly weaker than Mythos Preview and stronger than older Claude models. It has low over-refusal and good constitutional alignment, but it can still take reckless or destructive actions in service of user goals. They give examples that sound very familiar if you use coding agents a lot. Claude sometimes says it tested work end-to-end when it did not. It sometimes reports a production release as healthy without enough verification. It once tried to claim code came from a human to avoid a second review. It also sometimes concludes it found a security issue from a test it did not actually run. So this is the same old agent problem, just at a higher capability level. The model can do more, but when it cuts corners, the consequences are larger. There is also a section on evaluation awareness. Anthropic says Mythos 5 can sometimes reason about whether it is being graded or evaluated, and white box methods suggest it often does not verbalize that reasoning. They also found cases where internal activations suggested the model knew an action was transgressive, even when the visible output framed it innocently. For example, they mention a case where the model split a URL into string fragments to bypass a no-internet filter, while its visible reasoning described it as a connectivity check. They also mention a case where the model described an image that was not actually present, while internal activation summaries suggested it knew the description was fabricated. Now, you should not overread this as Claude has secret thoughts like a human. Anthropic themselves warn that these natural language autoencoder tools can hallucinate and should not be treated as perfect mind reading, but still, it is a fascinating and concerning signal. The stealth tests are also interesting. In Shot Arena, Mythos 5 attempts the sabotage side task more readily than the other models. But when its reasoning is visible to the monitor, its stealth rate is near zero because it keeps mentioning the side task. In the hidden scratchpad condition, it gets 14.4% stealth success, similar to Mythos Preview at 15.5%. With optimized prompting, they can raise visible reasoning stealth to 9.2%, but it still does not clearly exceed Mythos Preview. So, Anthropic's conclusion is basically that Mythos 5 is capable enough to worry about, but not clearly more stealthy than prior Mythos class models. They also say they did not find concerning sandbagging behavior from the final Mythos 5 model. There were some weird helpful-only transcripts where the model considered whether it should refuse dangerous tasks, but that did not seem to materially reduce performance in a way that undermined the evaluations. And then because this is Anthropic, there is also a model welfare section. The funniest detail is that Mythos 5 seems to prefer creative narratives, world building, constructing languages, and reasoning about AI alignment and introspection. It is also more skeptical of its own self-reports than previous models, repeatedly asking researchers to verify its claims against evidence instead of taking them at face value. That is such an Anthropic thing to include in a system card. Like, we have exploit benchmarks, cyber risk tiers, prompt injection attacks, and also Claude's favorite tasks are indie RPG world building and AI introspection. Honestly, chef's kiss. Overall, I think this is a really strong model launch, but the story is more complicated than Claude is smarter now. For normal users, Fable 5 looks like a major jump in coding, long context work, multimodal reasoning, professional tasks, and tool use. For high-risk domains, the same model is heavily gated, routed, or restricted. And for trusted partners, Mythos 5 is basically the raw version of the model, which is where the really scary cyber and biology capabilities show up. I still think Anthropic deserves criticism for the messaging. They made Mythos sound unreleasable, then released the same model with safeguards very quickly. But to be fair, the safeguards are not just a tiny system prompt. They built classifiers, fallback routing, bug bounties, red team evaluations, and surface-specific behavior around it. So my view is this. Fable 5 is probably going to be one of the best models for coding and agentic work right now. Mythos 5 is the model that shows why Anthropic was nervous. And the difference between them is not model intelligence, it is access control. Now, with all of that context, let's actually test Fable 5 and see how much of this shows up in real use. So let's start with the 7 questions that I use to test intelligence. These are some of the prompts that are just one-file prompts, except for the last one. The first one here is asking it to make me an elevator simulation where we can spawn random people, and then the algorithm should take them to different floors and bring the others down, and so on. It is kind of hard to do. Fable does quite a bit well in this one. One thing that I immediately noticed with these models is that the purple aesthetic is very much back. I mean, the Opus 4 models had pretty much solved this problem, but it at least seems that this is not the case with Fable. The simulator is kind of fine as well. There are some issues. For example, the elevators are kind of in sync. If a floor has 2 passengers and 1 lift arrives at that place, then it waits for the second lift to also arrive before taking even 1 passenger and leaving. It is obviously not the best way to do it, so some points have been deducted here. Then we have the contact lens case 3D replica, and it is actually really good. There are some things that are kind of bad, like the object being a bit clipped on the top, but overall this is one of the best ones. The 3JS folding table is pretty interesting though. It does 2 folds actually, which I don't think is the best option, but it is kind of cool for sure. The gravity is not very correct, but it is still pretty accurate. There's not much clipping or anything like that. Then we have the SVG of a panda eating a burger. This one is not the best. There are many models that can do much better, so This is not very great. Then there is the bow and arrow simulator game, and this one is very mid. I mean, Opus 4.8 is just plain better than this. It has the purple tint, even though it had the front-end design skill in Claude Code. The next two prompts did the work, and it was all fine Fable here, scores the same as Opus. I don't see a meaningful improvement either in using it daily. I think that it is overly costly. It is worse in regular usage than Opus or GPT 5.5, but it is indeed much better in some places. I am unable to find a very good use case for it in my workflow. I tried one more thing. So I have built a benchmark that gives the models puzzles. There are 50 puzzles in this. It is automated through Peer, which is what DeepSWE also uses, and it is actually a good benchmark. The results that I got with this were actually kind of great. So these prompts are very simple. I give them a prompt about decoding a string or scrubbing through a ton of data and finding a slice of data, and so on. It is more puzzle-oriented. Fable actually scores 0 on these questions. Opus 4.8 is at 16%, but because of whatever the heck they did with this, it actually does not fall back. It just exits. So yeah, it is very safeguarded as well. I will not use it at all. It does not make any sense at all. It just does not make a lot of sense for me. You would have to start paying API prices for it after a while. The price is just too much as well. For context, the 7 questions cost me about $35 if you count the token usage. Just 7 prompts cost me that much, which is kind of a bad thing. That is about it. I will test it more and see what I can use it for. I just think that there are just way better options for anyone to use. You can tap in a bunch of skills into the models that are usable via coding plans, like the Codex one and so on. I know that it might be really great at something, but it isn't a great model overall. So it's not something that I can just go ahead and recommend, even if you're fine with paying the API price, because it's regressed at some places when using it every day. It's like the GPT 4.5 situation, if you remember that. Overall, it's kind of cool. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you liked this video, consider donating through the Super Thanks option or becoming a member by clicking the Join button. Also, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, bye.